I've been working at a hospital as a nursing assistant for just over 2 years. Generally speaking, I love my job. I love the people I work with, the type of work I do, and especially the patients, regardless of how difficult some of them can be at times. My work normally consists of me cleaning up patients, getting them snacks or drinks, taking vitals, charting various things, and just helping the nurses with whatever else they need at any given time. There's a lot more to it as well, but that gives you a general idea of what I do. I work nights, so it's usually pretty slow and pretty quiet. I occasionally pick up shifts during the day, and they're rather hectic. There are family members all over coming up to visit the patients. Doctors are all over the place, and it just has a much busier feel. I regularly get floated to a different floor on many nights. Usually when this happens, it's to sit with a patient. Sometimes it's because they're recovering from a surgery, and I have to make sure they don't wake up and move in any type of way that could injure them or open up a wound. Other times, I will have to sit with a psych patient that needs to be observed overnight, also usually to ensure they don't hurt themselves. This was honestly my least favorite part of the job. Almost every time I sat with a patient, they were asleep and I got paid to sit in a chair and watch TV. I know this sounds like easy money, and I suppose it is, but the nights went by painfully slow. I would much rather be running up and down the halls on a different floor and wiping butts, but I would go where they needed me and do what they needed me to do. One night, I was particularly chosen to sit with a certain patient. Each time I'm ordered to sit with a patient, the patient's nurse briefs me on their condition and needs. This night, they picked me as I was one of the few male nursing assistants that were working that night. I'm not a huge guy, but I'm not small by any means either. The patient I was going to be sitting with had some pretty serious wounds and was in the process of recovering from surgery. I can't give out too many specific details, but he attempted to harm someone and they responded with deadly force. Obviously the patient lived, but he would have some recovery time, which was why he was in the hospital. The patient was a young male, and he also had some psychiatric issues. He was bipolar, and apparently he could go from friendly to dangerous in the blink of an eye. The patient had already previously attacked 2 other individuals that were sitting with him on 2 separate occasions. So I was told that his door needed to remain open. I was to sit on a chair outside of his room and watch him, and by no means was I to actually enter his room. It sounded easy enough, and I approached the patient's room, getting ready to start my long, boring night. Well, as it turned out, the night would be anything but boring. With the information I was given on the patient, I definitely had my guard up. If he were to attack me, the only thing I was allowed to do was try to get away from him and notify someone to call security. I wasn't allowed to put my hands on him to defend myself at all. I made it to the room, and the patient was out of bed, moving around his room. It didn't take long for me to recognize that he was going through a period of mania, which was honestly not the worst case scenario. Of course, it would have been preferable if he had just been asleep, but it seemed that he only became dangerous while in a depressive state. As soon as he saw me, he began talking to me. He started telling me all about himself. I engaged in the conversation in the friendliest way possible, while doing my best to not get too involved. He kept rearranging things in his room, took some form of bath in his sink, and just couldn't seem to stay still for more than a few seconds at a time. The situation itself was definitely a bit stressful, but he wasn't doing anything threatening to me at all. Little by little, I became more comfortable throughout the night. A few hours in, he was still awake and still moving around. Before I knew it, I had broken one of the rules and found myself sitting inside of his room rather than out in the hallway. We seemed to have built a level of rapport together, and I almost felt rude sitting out in the hallway while we talked. The next hour went by like this, and all was well. Time was moving quicker having someone to talk to, as opposed to playing on my phone or watching TV. The patient was still moving around his room, seemingly finding busy work for him to do. Before I knew it, the second rule was broken and the patient shut the door. Suddenly, I realized my situation. I was inside this man's room with the door shut, the same man that had violently attacked the last two individuals that had sat with him. I became unsure of what I should do. He didn't make any threatening gesture towards me after shutting the door. He just continued talking to me the same way he had been doing all night. I was on edge, but eventually settled down a bit once enough time had passed and his behavior didn't change. He stayed up the entire night, full of energy the entire time. Before I knew it, my shift was coming to an end. I felt very relieved that nothing bad had happened. I contribute it to the fact that I do very well at reading people and responding appropriately. Also, the fact that the patient didn't seem to go into a depressive state helped. When my shift was over, another male nursing assistant from first shift came to relieve me. He knocked a couple times and opened the door before greeting us. The patient immediately looked like he went into some type of defensive position and asked what the other NA was doing there. I explained to him that my shift was over and the other guy would be hanging out with him instead. Well, the patient seemed to really take a liking to me and wasn't happy with what I told him. He seemed to get immediately triggered, and I could even see his face warp into this scary form of anger. He told the other NA to get out of his room, yelling at him at this point. The NA took a couple steps forward, attempting to explain that my shift was over and his was beginning. That ended up being a bad decision. The patient lunged at him and dragged him to the ground before he started pummeling him. I yelled down the hall to the nursing station for them to call security. I couldn't do much to help the guy getting beat up, but I tried pulling him away from the patient, which didn't work. I didn't know what else to do, so I started saying the patient's name, trying to get his attention. He seemed to be in a rage and unable to hear me. Finally, I got his attention and I said to him, "I'm your friend and you need to listen to me." For a moment, he finally paused what he was doing and looked at me. I told him he was hurting someone that did nothing wrong, someone that was actually there to help him. I kept talking to him to keep his attention, saying anything I could think of so he wouldn't go back to beating on the poor NA. It actually worked, and I was able to get him to stand up. The NA ran down the hall, and I was able to get the patient back into his room. I made the extremely questionable decision of shutting us both into his room, but I felt like it was the best thing I could do to protect the other nurses and patients. I continued talking to him until security showed up. Again, he attempted to rush them, but they were very prepared. Unlike the nurses, security did have the authority to put their hands on patients if it were necessary. They were able to detain him in a safe way. We ended up getting him in his bed and placed him in 4-point restraints, which means both of his wrists and both of his ankles were tied to his bed, limiting his movement. I didn't end up sitting with this patient again, even though I would have been willing to. After this third incident, the patient was usually kept in restraints. Luckily, he didn't injure himself and reopen his incisions from surgery. The last I heard, he spent 2 more nights on the recovery floor and then was moved to psych. Several years ago, I had to spend some time in the hospital. I had to have a surgery done. It wasn't anything very serious, but I was going to be there for a few days recovering. Well, the surgery went as well as possible. Eventually, I was moved up to the floor where I would be spending the rest of my time until I was discharged. Unfortunately, it ended up being a 2-person room, so there was another patient in the room with me. We were separated by a curtain. My bed was the closer one to the door and restroom. I never saw my roommate, but I sure heard him. Apparently, they couldn't get around very well, so they just had to use a portable toilet thing next to their bed. The nurses would come in and help them out of bed and everything. It was kind of gross at times because I would hear and smell things that weren't exactly pleasant. Also, he would talk often. and it was always nonsense. I couldn't really tell how old he was, but he sounded maybe upper middle-aged. I figured he had some mental issues or something, and did my best to ignore him. Nothing he would ramble would make any sense. He wasn't extremely loud at least, just excessive rambling at times. The second night I was there, I got woken up by some things clattering around. My roommate was walking around making noise. I was under the impression that he couldn't walk, and that was why he needed the assistance. But I was able to see him walking underneath the curtain. It was hard to see because it was pretty dark, and he definitely wasn't moving around fast, but he definitely was walking. I really didn't think much more about it and was able to fall back asleep pretty easily. It was the third and final evening I was going to be spending the night at the hospital, and like usual, my roommate was making noise. It seemed as if he had not slept once since I was in his room, just rambling, moving things around, etc. I fell asleep that night rather easily, but was awoken at some point. I remember trying to listen to see what woke me up, but it was actually silent in the room. The man had apparently finally fallen asleep, which was good for the both of us. I used the restroom and went back to sleep. Again, I was woken up. It was still dark outside, so I knew it must have been extremely early. There was a nurse standing next to my bed, so I figured they either needed to check my vitals or give me medication. But instead, the nurse told me that I was going to be moved into a different room. Being very annoyed at this due to the time of day, I asked why. The nurse just told me there was a problem with my roommate. I asked what the problem was, but they said they couldn't tell me. Another nurse came in and they disconnected all the plugs and stuff from the wall that my bed was hooked up to. The nurse at the foot of the bed told me to keep looking at her as they started wheeling me out. I was confused at first, but realized she didn't want me looking over towards my roommate. So naturally, out of curiosity, I did my best to get a peek over to his side of the room before they wheeled me out. Well, my curiosity was certainly satisfied. Just as I was being turned as we exited the room, I saw what they didn't want me looking at. There was blood all over the floor. It was everywhere on his side of the room, more than I've ever seen before. It looked like something out of a movie. I didn't see the man himself, but I'm guessing he had done something to himself. It explains why he was quiet prior to the nurses waking me up. I looked back at the nurse, and she just had a sad look on her face. I didn't ask any more questions about it, as I knew they wouldn't answer them anyway. Also, it would have felt disrespectful to do so. They already had an awful situation they had to deal with. I can only speculate what drove that man to that. I'm guessing he had some type of mental issue, something that kept him awake every night. I would imagine that after so much of that, it could drive anyone crazy. Even if I stay awake all night for one night, I'm a wreck. I couldn't imagine going through that night after night. Anyway, I left the hospital the next day, and I've been doing well ever since. But now, anytime I hear anyone mumbling and not speaking clearly, it brings me back to those 3 nights I spent in the hospital with that poor man. I work in transportation at the hospital. It's a pretty decent job and usually pretty easy. Basically, I get orders to move patients around, usually for when the patient needs an X-ray, MRI, or some other type of testing. I simply go to their room and bring them where they need to go, sometimes in a wheelchair, other times they need to be moved in their bed, especially if they're switching rooms. There's a small office type thing in the basement where whoever is on shift hangs out between transports. The basement is also where all the various imaging testing rooms are at, so we're down in that part of the hospital waiting to bring patients back to their rooms anyway. The hospital I work at is quite large, and the basement is a maze of hallways. It was extremely intimidating when I first started working there, but eventually I learned my way around. The basement also includes the large laundry area, the kitchen, and the morgue. The morgue is only for the temporary storage of bodies, where they are kept until they are moved elsewhere. There aren't autopsies or anything that are conducted at the hospital itself, but it's still pretty creepy. Walking into the room and then into the cooler always gives me a terrible feeling. But part of my job in transportation is to sometimes wheel the bodies down there. I do a lot of other various tasks or favors for people, but the main part of my job is just getting patients from point A to point B. This job kind of just fell into my lap, and I otherwise have very little interest in healthcare. I can also be very squeamish easily, but luckily, my job doesn't involve me dealing with a lot of unpleasant things. And if I'm transporting a patient and they throw up or have any type of accident, I get a nurse to deal with it, as I'm thankfully not trained to do that kind of hands-on patient care. This story took place only 2 weeks ago, and every time I think about it, it gives me goosebumps and puts a knot in my stomach. Maybe typing out the entire experience will be helpful, but who knows. So I was working my 7 p.m. to 7 a.m. shift like normal, which I do 3 times a week. Around 2:30 a.m., I received a call informing me that a patient had died a bit earlier and was needing to be transported to the morgue. I went up to the floor they were on, moved them onto a gurney from their bed, and began my way to the basement. Like usual, when I was entering the cooler, I just got that weird feeling I always felt. I rolled the gurney to its appropriate location and was going to head back to the office. I went to push the bar that unlocks the door to open it, but the door wouldn't budge. I tried again, and then again a few other times, but for whatever reason, it just wouldn't open. After realizing I wasn't going to be getting myself out of there on my own, I got my cell phone out. The cell service at the hospital isn't good to begin with, and it's even worse in the basement. But where I was in the cooler, there was basically no service at all. My phone would go from one bar to no service over and over. I tried making a phone call, but it wouldn't ring. I also tried sending text messages, but those kept failing. The cooler is kept at about 35 degrees, just over freezing, so I was starting to get a little worried. I was not at all dressed to be in that temperature, and I knew no one else would be coming in there for any reason for quite some time. Soon enough, I went from being nervous to completely terrified. I would keep trying the door, and then walk around to different parts of the cooler to try to see if I could get a signal. That's when I heard a noise. At first, I was hopeful it was someone nearby that could possibly help me, but I quickly realized the noise was much closer. It was in fact coming from the inside of the cooler itself. There is a rather dim light that always stays on in the cooler, and there are additional lights you can turn on if you need to. At this point, only the dim light was on, so I could see, but not incredibly well. I looked in the direction of the sound I heard, and then I saw it. The body bag of the person I had just wheeled down to the cooler began to move. It was very subtle at first, but it was clearly moving. I am aware that the human body can move a bit after death due to gases and other things settling, but this was different. This was unlike anything I've ever seen before. The movement was quick and repetitive, despite being small movements. I was absolutely freaked out. I thought something insane was happening, or that the patient was still alive. I don't know which idea terrified me most at the time, but I knew I had to check. As I slowly began inching my way over to where they were, that one single light began flickering. I believe once this happened, I was on the verge of a panic attack. It was just too much to take in all at once. I was frozen in place for a while, but knew I still had to check on the person. I finally gathered the courage to slowly start moving towards them again, when suddenly, the body shot upright into a sitting position. It was in a way that no human could do. I literally screamed when this happened, and again ran to the door. I was beating on the door and yelling for someone to help me, despite knowing that probably no one would be able to hear me from where I was at. Just then, the light completely went out. I was frantically feeling around for the light switch to turn on more lights, but I wasn't having any luck finding it. I heard more noise behind me and turned around to look. I nearly fainted as I saw a ghostly apparition of a woman menacingly coming towards me. I began screaming again and covered my eyes. As I began cowering down, my back hit into the release bar of the door, and by some miracle it opened. I fell backwards onto my butt, and just then the light came back on and was no longer flickering. I could see inside the cooler and everything looked just as it should be. The body was where I put it, and there wasn't anything moving or making noise. I quickly got out of there and spent the rest of my shift looking over my shoulder. I have always been a big skeptic. I just don't believe in paranormal type things. I believe my incident was caused by the cold temperature and the stress and anxiety I felt while being locked in the cooler. But even with that being said, anytime I go into the cooler from now on, I don't let the door shut behind me.